we are going to have the session in English, but as I ask Saba and Alma, they will talk very slowly so we can understand everything. If you have tienen preguntas, como decía Isaías, pónganlos en el cuadro de preguntas y respuestas y se las traduzco a Alma y a Saba, que nos hacen el gran favor de estar con nosotros. Voy a presentarlas. I will introduce you in Spanish. Voy a introducirlas, su biografía en español, y vamos a empezar después con Alma y luego Saba, ¿no? Alma Heckman es profesora de la cátedra Neufeld Levy en estudios del Holocausto en la Universidad de California, Santa Cruz, y profesora asistente en el Departamento de Historia de la misma universidad. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen la historia judía moderna, el activismo político judío transnacional, el colonialismo, nacionalismo y el sincretismo en el norte de África y Medio Oriente. Actualmente ella está trabajando para digitalizar, transcribir y publicar entrevistas con refugiados judíos europeos de la Segunda Guerra Mundial que encontraron refugio en el Medio Oriente y en el norte de África. Heckman recibió su doctorado en UCLA y anteriormente ha tenido becas en el Museo Conmemorativo del Holocausto en Estados Unidos y en el Centro de Estudios Judíos de UCLA. Alma nos va a hablar de un tema interesantísimo, que son los judíos de Marruecos. Ella tiene un libro del cual nos platicará, que yo lo voy a leer, ya lo pedí, me llegará pronto acá a Chile, sobre los judíos comunistas de Marruecos. Es súper interesante lo que ella investiga y creo que también nos aproxima desde otra perspectiva al mundo de los judíos marroquíes. Saba Sumek es directora asociada de la Organización de Derechos Humanos American Jewish Committee de Los Ángeles. Ella es profesora en The Academy for Jewish Religion, donde imparte cursos de estudios religiosos, historia del Medio Oriente. Ella es licenciada en estudios religiosos por la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Tiene una maestría en estudios teológicos en Harvard Divinity School y su doctorado lo hizo en estudios religiosos en la Universidad de California, Santa Bárbara. Saba enseña y escribe sobre las religiones del mundo, las mujeres y la religión, la interseccionalidad y su impacto en la comunidad judía, la geopolítica del Medio Oriente. Saba es muy activa, participa, por ejemplo, en el programa de becarios 2021 del Centro Internacional Rey Abdullah bin Abdulaziz para el Diálogo Interreligioso e Intercultural, que es una organización que promueve el diálogo interreligioso para prevenir y resolver conflictos. Fue becaria residente en Oxford, en el Instituto de Estudios del Antisemitismo Global, y es editora del libro Sefaradí and Mizrahi Jews in America, que se publicó en el 2016, y autora del libro From the Shas to Los Ángeles, Three Generations of Iranian Jews Women Between Religion and Culture. I am waiting for those books also. So thank you, my friends, to be here with us. Alma, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And I have to say, I understand Spanish, but I speak it very, very poorly. So for those of you who do want to ask questions, I know that Manuel already said, but please feel free to address them in Spanish. I can't understand, but my spoken Spanish is lamentably terrible. So I'm going to speak for 15-20 minutes. I haven't honestly timed it, and I have a small baby next to me as well, who I'm currently bouncing with one foot and a little baby bouncer. So if she starts screaming, we might end there. So I'll go as slowly and as intelligibly as I can with those limitations. So let me share my screen for the PowerPoint. Oh, I don't see a way to, oh, there we are. Okay. No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Oh, now I can, I think. Okay, perfect. So you should be able to see my screen. So I find it's kind of interesting that I'm asked to speak on a day about Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, because my book, which you see here, The Sultan's Communists, Moroccan Jews and the Politics of Belonging, I overtly follow those Moroccan Jews who stayed in Morocco after 1948 and after Morocco's independence in 1956. And those and the Jews that I followed, these Moroccan Jewish communists, they were very, very patriotic. They saw for Jews and for themselves a future in post-independence Morocco and worked to foster that vision of Jewish life in post-independence Morocco. And indeed, the people that I write about in this book saw out-migration, saw the migration of Jews from Morocco to be a kind of betrayal to this Moroccan nationalist vision. And they were deeply, deeply anti-Zionist. They were anti-French colonization, they were anti-Spanish colonization, but they were also against any force that would reduce the connection of Moroccan Jews to Morocco. And the Communist Party was their way of participating in national liberation politics in Morocco. And that's a common thread for Jews in the Middle East and North Africa more broadly. I won't talk about it too much here, but in Egypt, for example, there was a very large Jewish engagement in the Communist Party. In Iraq, there was very large Jewish engagement in the Communist Party. In Iran, in the Tudeh Party, as it was known, there was very large Jewish engagement. In Algeria, in Tunisia. So there's a lot to be said about Jewish patriotism in the region that persists well after the sort of flashpoint moments of 1948, 1956 and onward. So, as much as we can talk about the history of Jews that left the region and moved to places like Israel or France or Los Angeles or many other sorts of places, there's also a very rich history of Jews that remained in these locations. And till today, Iran has the largest Jewish community in the Middle East and North Africa. Turkey also has a significant Jewish community still. Morocco still has a significant Jewish community. So the history proceeds, right? And it would be a mistake for us to think only about the history of those Jews who left. While they were very large in number, and there are a lot of interesting political forces that led to that dispersal, there's a lot to say about those Jews who choose to stay in Morocco. And indeed, Jews from Morocco were not exactly refugees. My book and many scholarly works demonstrate this. This is not to say that life wasn't difficult for Jews at particular historical junctures in Morocco, but they were never subject to expulsions or official government intimidation campaigns as Jews were in Iraq and in Egypt, right? That's why it's so important to distinguish across the region, right? To think about contextual specificities across the region. And this is an extremely important distinction to consider when we think about the history of Jews across the entire region. Indeed, the Moroccan Sultan turned king overtly made statements protecting the Jews of Morocco at a number of different intervals. Jewish heritage is enshrined in the Moroccan constitution. There are Muslim scholars in Morocco who are devoted to the study of Jewish history and Jewish studies and the study of Hebrew as well. And we must resist overly simplistic understandings of quote unquote Arab versus quote unquote Jew. As many scholars have pointed out, after all, there is such a thing, after all, as an Arab Jew. And for the people that I write about in this book, their Moroccanness was very much internally bound up with their Jewishness. They were mutually constitutive with one another. And so we must engage with historical nuance and contextually specific understandings of Jews across the region, indeed, as with all histories and peoples. So how I became interested in this book, in the topic for this book, dates back to 2009, 2010. I was a Fulbright fellow in Morocco. And when I was there, I became very interested in this verbal distinction between Moroccan versus Moroccan Jew, right? Why did Moroccan Jew need to have that extra qualification? And at the time, I also was volunteering at the Jewish Museum in Casablanca, where I met Simone Levy. And Simone Levy himself is one of the subjects I trace in this book. He was a Moroccan Jewish political activist and scholar of Moroccan Judeo-Spanish known as Hakitiya. And he was a communist leader, a communist activist. He was part of the struggle for Morocco's independence from French and Spanish colonial rule. And I began to wonder, at that point, I'd never heard of Jews' involvement in national liberation struggles and independence struggles across the region. I hadn't yet started my graduate work. And I began to wonder how exceptional was somebody like Simone Levy. The book is itself the result of 10 years of inquiry, sparked by conversations and interviews that I did with Simone Levy. The archival research was conducted in Morocco, in France, in Israel, the United States, and the UK, in French, Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, and English. And I also very luckily had access to personal archives, including the personal papers of Simone Levy, as well as interviews with other former communist members. This is the first book to examine Jewish participation in Morocco's anti-colonial movement and the problems of political and social belonging Jews faced, not only during colonial rule, but after as well. And the book's narrative follows the lives of 5 prominent Moroccan Jewish communists. And I'm not going to be able, I'll show you the photos of all these people, but I'm not going to be able to delve into the rich stories of all of these figures. So if you have questions about them in the Q&A, I'd be delighted to answer them. But the figures are Léon René Sultan, who was himself actually an Algerian Jew who had French citizenship by dint of something called the Crémieux Decree of 1870 that granted out most of North Africa. Anyway, he was the founders of the Moroccan Communist Party. Then we have Edmond Amran Al-Maleh, Abraham Serfati, Simone Levy, and Sion Asidon. So these are the major figures that I trace around the book, and it goes in a kind of chronological thematic order from basically the 1920s until, indeed up until the present, actually, in many ways. Overall, the book presents the untold story of Jewish radicals' involvement in Morocco's national liberation project. The chapters extend from the beginning of leftist movements and demographic upheaval in the 1920s through the high point of Jewish political activism in the immediate post-World War II period to Morocco's repressive post-independence political history in the 1970s, concluding with a discussion of the 1990s and the Moroccan state's lionization of its Jewish past. This scope, encompassing both the colonial and the Cold War contexts, brings into view the connections between the demographic and ideological shifts within both Morocco's Jewish population and the Moroccanized communism, as well as the power of the Moroccan state. One of the conclusions, or one of the perspectives this book offers, is that studying Moroccan Jewish communists demonstrates the possibility of Jewish patriotism in the Middle East and North Africa long after independence and regional wars with Israel that contributed to the massive Jewish exodus from so much of the region, including Morocco, during the 1960s and 70s. Okay, so now I know we're short on time, but I want to show you some slides and some archival images that help illustrate a few of these points. This is Léon René Sultan from a 1946 pamphlet after his death. He was one of the founding figures of the Moroccan Communist Party, again, born in Algeria before moving to Morocco and starting his law practice. This is Edmond Amran Al-Maleh, who was a primary figure in the Moroccan Communist Party during the struggle for independence, and indeed was more or less a de facto leader of the party when the party's Secretary General Ali Yatta was in exile for a good portion of the struggle for independence. And here's one quote from him in 1949 in the communist newspaper, Espoir, or Hope. He said, "We are Moroccans. We are not foreigners, as the Zionists would have us believe. We are deeply Moroccan," right? So you can get a sense or a flavor of these political beliefs. And I have to say, you know, I'm talking about a minority of a minority. Most Jews in Morocco were not part of the Communist Party. Most Jews in Morocco did in fact leave from the period of the late 1940s into the late 1960s. So I hope I'm making the point that this is a minority of a minority, but an important one to think about nonetheless. Here is Simone Levy, who I mentioned before, who inspired the project, his library card, which I think has a very fetching image of him. So Moroccan TV made a documentary about Simone Levy and Edmond Amran Al-Maleh, and here the two of them were actually teachers together at a school in Casablanca for a while. So, you know, this goes to show Moroccan TV is still very much invested in the story of Jews in the country and portrays them in TV documentaries and news magazines and all of these sorts of things. Here is Abraham Serfati, who was a major activist in the Moroccan Communist Party and founder of a far leftist group after he decided the Moroccan Communist Party had sort of betrayed its ideals by the late 1960s, and he founded his own further leftist party, Ila al-Amam, meaning forward in Arabic. And here he is on the cover of Jeune Afrique, or Young Africa. Very importantly, he was one of Morocco's longest serving political prisoners because he contested Morocco's claim to Western Sahara, which has been in the news because of the agreement brokered by the United States between Morocco and Israel to normalize relations. Right now, there are direct flights, for example, between Israel and Morocco. But the crux of it was its international acceptance of Morocco's claim to the Western Sahara. And so he was imprisoned in part because of his rejection of those claims for a very long time. Here is a primary source document that gives you another kind of flavor for this. This is around 1956, I believe, the Suez War. It says, "We, the undersigned Moroccan Jews, publicly and unequivocally condemn Zionist propaganda as an instrument of imperialism and as a weapon of division used against the entirety of the Moroccan people. We rise to action against the Zionist agents who, speculating on the deep hopes of Moroccan Jews for dignity, well-being, and security, push the latter to expatriate themselves, while Muslims and Jews must unite their efforts to achieve national liberation and to create in their country conditions for a good life, guaranteeing democracy, well-being, and security for all. Anxious to defend our country against all calumny, we denounce the international campaign against Morocco led by imperialist hypocrites who are trying to create a racist climate here in order to discredit our country and tear away the Jewish population from the national community. We declare that, on strictly patriotic grounds, we will fight against all discrimination concerning the rights and freedoms of citizens, persuaded as we are that this country is ours and that no one will be able to deprive us of it," and it's signed by a number of Jewish Moroccan political activists, especially those in the Communist Party. Here, after the 1967 conflict with Israel, King Hassan II made this statement: "The government of His Majesty the King reminds Moroccans of the Jewish faith that their rights as enshrined in the Constitution are completely contradictory with any support or aid they might provide Zionism. Consequently, the government won't hesitate to apply in all its rigor the law against those who have been convinced to collude with Zionism, and reminds you that such collusion will lead to the stripping of one's nationality. The state alone has the ability to assure public order and protect the rights of all nations. It will not tolerate any kind of provocation and will not permit anyone taking justice into their own hands." And I'm happy to address this more in the Q&A, but there's a very interesting history of King Hassan II's engagement with Zionism, with the state of Israel, and the position of King Hassan II during this time period is an interesting and delicate balance of trying to create sort of pan-Arabist bona fides in the region, while also making statements of protection toward Moroccan Jews, while also more secretly, especially in the 1970s and 80s, dealing with Israeli diplomats in a direct or indirect fashion. And I'm very excited to hear what Dr. Someh will have to say, because there's actually a lot of really interesting parallels with Iran in this time period as well. But we'll get there when we get there. Okay, Manuel, please let me know if I'm rambling on and on. I just want to show these few documents that I find so exciting. So also in 1967, the Moroccan Jewish communists produced this document: "We, the undersigned, consider Morocco to be our one and only country, inspired by the intangible principle in our behavior as active citizens. Consider it our duty to express our point of view as Moroccan Jewish patriots imbued with democratic ideals. We deny Zionism the right to decide the politics of global Judaism, to declare itself the representative and defender of our interests. Far from helping resolve the Jewish question, as it claims, Zionism has, on the contrary, gravely compromised the future of Jews in the world. We remain convinced that in this critical hour, when Morocco needs all its children, The duty of every enlightened Moroccan Jew is to maintain solidarity in any way possible with their people, to fight the ideology and politics of Zionism rooted in the communities of the Jewish minority in order to instill within them a complete national consciousness. And I can say, you know, these kinds of documents, this material from Moroccan Jewish communists were not overly persuasive to the vast majority of Moroccan Jews. The vast majority of Moroccan Jews saw these figures as disruptive pariahs that could reflect poorly and potentially endanger the broader Jewish community. So we have a very stark differing of perspectives of how to work within the Moroccan state and what is in the best interests of the Moroccan Jewish community. Okay, I will, let's see, I've been talking for a while, sorry, but just share a few more documents. So this is from Abraham Serfati's early 1990s prison release campaign. He became the subject of an international human rights campaign. And it says, in the country where the sun is king, women and men disappear in the shadow of the kingdom. Hassan II, King of Morocco, detains the longest serving political prisoner in the world since the liberation of Nelson Mandela. So that's how we know it's from the early 90s. Simone Levy himself, rather than being a pariah of the state, actually chose to work more with the state and stood for local elections. So this is actually from his 1976 local election poster in Casablanca. And you can see it's for the Party of Progress and Socialism. The Moroccan Communist Party was overtly banned, so it rebranded itself a few different times. And this iteration in 1976, the Party of Progress and Socialism was the party that worked for him. My baby is punctuating my speech. Okay, this is to illustrate the point that Moroccan Jews are very much part of the public conversation, public discourse in Morocco today. Zaman means time in Arabic, and it is a history magazine that's published in Morocco, and there have been several different editions devoted to the history of Moroccan Jews. So it's still it's not a taboo subject in the slightest. Simone Levy received wide coverage upon his death, and there he is in the Jewish Museum that he helped found in the mid-1990s. So he was very much a public intellectual and activist figure, underscoring his thesis of the essential Moroccanness of Jews and the belonging of Jews in Morocco. Even after his death, his son, who you see pictured at the bima of a synagogue in Fez, actually this synagogue was restored after Simone Levy's death. And it became a big public celebration. It was partially sponsored by the German government and also the Moroccan government, and had officials from many different capacities speaking there, addressing the longevity of Jews in Morocco and the public intellectual and historical contributions of Jews there as well. Okay, so I look forward to any questions you may have. I know that's a huge amount in a very short amount of time. So thank you for your patience, and I will pass the Zoom mic to Saba.
Thank you so much, Alma. Thank you, Manny, for having us. Alma, we should talk. You know, my dad's side of the family, my great uncles, were all a part of the Tudeh party in Iran and in and out of jail because the Shah put them there. And then ironically, most of them left to Israel because they were in and out of jail so much in Tehran. So I was inspired by Alma. I was just going to give a talk, and then I thought I'll just also do a PowerPoint. But I won't do the whole thing because it's a very long one, but it's just a lot of images. So it's a good way to kind of just show the Iranian Jewish community through pictures. And what we see here, I'm looking at the Persian, Iranian, American Jewish community. And within this context, I will talk about my own work and what brought me to this place. And Alma, it's so hard to concentrate when I see that little cuteness in your arms. So over here, of course, we have a flag of America, the old flag of Iran, which is what a lot of Iranian Jews still look to because they don't really acknowledge, I mean, of course they do, but they feel zero ties to the current Islamic regime of Iran. And then what I argue a lot about and discuss a lot about is because Iranian Jews really cannot go back to Iran and everything was taken away. The first and second generation growing up in America, specifically in Los Angeles, in New York, where you have the largest Iranian Jewish communities, really look to Israel and Zionism as a sense of spiritual home. So let's talk about Iran. When we talk about Iran, Iran's not really the Middle East, it's Central Asia. And in this way, it's getting a lot of influence from different regions that aren't specific to the Middle East. And as Iranians will tell you, they are not Arabs, they are Indo-Europeans, and they're getting a lot of influence from that context. I wanted to show you the Iranian Jewish experience through my family's photographs. And this will just basically give you a timeline of how everything happened. And of course, as Manny said, my focus a lot is on women. So this is where I really begin to explore, because so much of what we look at when we look at history could be seen on the way women's lives are impacted, from their clothing to their education. So here we have a picture of my great-grandmother on her wedding day in Hamadan, which is the biblical town of Shushan from the story of Queen Esther. Oh, sorry, let me just put my timer on because I could go on forever. So sorry. The story of Queen Esther. And this is my great-grandmother on her wedding day in Hamadan in 1910. She was 9 years old when she got married, which was very typical at that time period, especially for religious minorities, to make sure that the women married within the community. And as all the women in my family told me, my great-grandmother had turquoise blue eyes. And if a Shia Muslim wanted to marry her, her family would have absolutely no authority to say no. So they married her off very young to ensure that she married into the Jewish community. And my family here is living in the Mahaleh, which means the Jewish ghetto, where Jews were placed in towns all over. And if you look at the way they're dressed, they are dressed like Shia Muslims because they had to live and follow those rules. And so you see the chador, which is in Arabic what's referred to as the hijab, and they do not really look any different than what you would see as a Muslim or a Christian or Zoroastrian or a Baha'i woman dress like. So this great-grandmother ends up having children and ends up having my grandmother right here. Again, this is still under Shia Islamic rule, under the Qajar dynasty. So the women are dressed in hijabs, well, chadors, and they are following Shia Islamic rule. And then what happened was that in 1930s, specifically 1936, what happened was you had the Qajar dynasty was basically kicked out. Then you have the Pahlavi dynasty come in, a dynasty full of secularization, Europeanization, romanticization with European life. And so then this grandmother, who did get married at 12 and had her first child at 14, ends up right here with my grandfather and her 9 children. This picture was taken in the 1940s. And if you look at this picture, this could be, yes, they're dark, but this could be Poland. This could be France. This is by 1936, it was illegal to wear the chador and you had to dress in secular European clothes in Iran, and the Jewish community loved that and ate that up. My family was educated under the Alliance schools, and so they were heavily influenced by French Jewish ideals, the French way of dressing, and the women would literally get tutorials on how to do their makeup and how to dress and how to do their ties, etc. And then you see this grandmother right here, who is now here in Los Angeles. She has passed away, but here she is with her daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, and great-great-granddaughter. And so now you have 5 generations now living in Los Angeles. This is what happens when you have your first child at 14. You live to see, your great-grandchildren. And I think this is really interesting because if you look at this picture, what you see here is the clock set that Persian Jews, the matriarchs, give to their daughters when they get married. And it's a vintage antique European clock set, and that's what we all have. And there's nothing Persian about this. this is completely European, obviously, and this really shows you how influenced the Persian Jewish community, which under the Pahlavi dynasty, specifically under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, really drank, in a sense, the Kool-Aid of Europeanization and everything that the Shah did in regards to loving and being fascinated with all things European, our community appropriated as they got out of the ghettos, the Mahaleh, started acculturating into Iranian life. Most moved to Tehran, where there was less anti-Semitism, became the nouveau riche, lost everything, came to America, worked their way again, and you still see a lot of that European influence. And this is the cover of my book with my great grandmother on the cover, and this was really special to me. It was like really the only picture we escaped Iran with. And the reason why I wrote my book was because, as someone who has a PhD in religious studies, I was actually going to, because I lived in India, do something between my PhD on the comparison between Hindu sacred scriptures and the Talmud, looking at women. And I was just ended up taking a lot of Middle Eastern history courses and recognized there was a dearth of material on Iranian Jews, let alone Iranian Jewish women. And I knew that I would be the only one who would be able to do it. The community, like most Middle Eastern communities, especially minority religious communities in the Middle East, is very insular, very, I mean, not closed off, but you keep your privacy and your family secrets. We have the saying, behind the curtains in Farsi. So I knew that this is what I wanted to focus on. And I knew that as an Iranian Jew who grew up in this community, I would have access and people would be able to trust me with their stories. Why did I focus on the women's story? Because there were no historians really writing about Iranian Jewish women. I was taking a lot of courses on Iran, and all of the classes that were being offered to me at Berkeley, at Harvard, and at Santa Barbara were either from a secular Iranian Muslim perspective or a religious Shia Muslim perspective, but nothing about the religious minorities and the women who lived these lives. I also grew up with the matriarchs in my family talking about what it was like to get married at 9, 10, 11 years old, to quit school, to have 9 children, outlive your children, go through the Qajar dynasty, which was religious, and then secularization under the Shah, and then give up everything and start all over again in a country like America, where it is all about independence. You marry for love, you move out at 18 years old, you have boundaries with your family, and this is the complete opposite of most Jewish communities in the Middle East. So you can imagine how scared they were raising first generation, second generation of children. And also I looked to these women, and to me, these women were my rock stars. How did they cope and how did they live, living in the Mahaleh, raising children, getting pregnant at 12, not having an education, but starting all over again, moving in with their in-laws because that's what they had to do, never looking at a man, because in Farsi it's called najib, where you had to be sexually pure. You couldn't even look at a man. And then all of a sudden you're married off to a man who's at least a decade older, and you have to move in with his family, in a sense, almost become like a maidservant, because there was a pecking order of women in the household, because everyone lived with their in-laws, the brothers, the sisters, their children, etc. So I knew this generation was dying, and it was really important for me, because they were in their late, 80s and 90s, to sit down and hear their stories. So I ended up writing this book. I interviewed 120 women, ages 18 to 90, in Los Angeles, because unfortunately, even though I was born in Iran, I don't have the luxury to go to Iran to do any of my research because it's too dangerous. And so thus I have to focus on the expat Iranian community. And so I did 3 different generations: grandmother, mother, and daughter generation. The daughter generation now growing up in America and looking at their lives, their religiosity, secularization, sexuality, etc. So just a quick understanding of the Iranian Jewish community. We are one of the oldest Jewish communities in the diaspora. Most people erroneously assume we're from 586 BCE, but most historians will say we come from the Assyrian conquest, 721, 722 CE. BCE, which means that we're almost 2,700 years old. If you look at Persian Jewish history, they loved King Cyrus. Here's pictures of Persepolis. The Cyrus Cylinder, which there is a copy at the United Nations, specifically discusses religious pluralism. And so under his rule, the Jews flourished, as we know. And what became really interesting is Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, in a sense, tried to eradicate the Shia influence on the country and really usurped the Ahmadid, the Cyrus, and his family. And so when you look at Iranian Jews, all of the generations that were brought up under the Pahlavis, all of our, for example, my father's generation, which is, growing up still under Shia Islam, all the names are Muslim: Hamid, Musa, Nadir, Nasser. My mom, who is 13 years younger, growing up under the Pahlavis, they all have names based from King Cyrus and his family. So they really appropriated secular Zoroastrian names. With Sunni Islam and then later Shia Islam coming to Iran, things really changed for Iranian Jews. Well, I should call it Persia at this point because it was in Iran then. The state religion was Shia Islam, and under the Safavid dynasty, Safavids became obsessed with purity and impurity. My own research traces this back to Zoroastrian traditions. And so now Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians were placed in the same category as dogs, pigs, and feces. They were considered to be najas, religiously impure. They were forced to live, relegated to live in the Maleh, the Jewish ghetto, where they would throw animal carcass, because an animal carcass was equivalent to a Jew. My grandmother would tell me stories, and this was up until 1925, where she could not go out in the rain because if the water touched her body and got into the water system, it would render a Shia Muslim impure. You couldn't eat from the same, you couldn't go to the same bazaar to buy food because you couldn't touch the food. So what jobs did Iranian Persian Jews have? When Shia Islam came, they outlawed secular music, but Persians love their music. They love their poetry. So in a sense, it was almost as if, the Persian Jewish community were similar to Southern Black people in the 1950s and before. You come in through the back door, you don't touch anything, you perform secular music for us, and then you leave through the back door. So the Persian Jews are credited for holding on to a lot of the secular music from this time period. Another job that they had was they would illegally make alcohol. Alcohol became illegal under Shia Islam, and they became the bootleggers of the community. And yes, if they're najas, a Shia Muslim shouldn't even be, touching their alcohol. But if this person was religious, they wouldn't even be drinking alcohol in the first place. So they were bootlegging a lot of alcohol and making it and illegally selling that too. They were also involved in jobs that were considered impure, such as working with silver and working with fabrics and block printing. And one of the biggest jobs that Iranian Jews have in Los Angeles, if you go to downtown Los Angeles, is that they are involved in the fabric business. And this goes all the way back to the 16th century. And this is the Jewish Maleh in Tehran, which of course now does not exist. And it's all high rises. The synagogue in Tehran. And then we get to the Pahlavi dynasty, secularization, emancipation, modernity. I don't want to romanticize this time period because this was also a time period of a lot of human rights abuses if you did not agree with the Pahlavis. Reza Pahlavi and then his son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who Iranian Jews from my interviews loved. They were secular. They told them to come out of the mahallahs, be a part of school, be a part of education. For the most part, if you lived in Tehran, you didn't really deal with anti-Semitism. You were living in northern Tehran where it was posh. You were going to discotheques. You were going to Europe. My mother went to school, went to a Jewish day school in Tehran, went to Tehran University, became a secretary at the American Embassy. So she was going out with my dad to discos and listening to music. And, one of the biggest downfalls we see of the Shah is his party in Persepolis, where it costs hundreds of millions of dollars, at least 115 million, and that's a conservative estimate. And it's funny because if you listen to female historians about this moment, they will say, you know, it was disgusting. There was so much, you know, lavishness while the country was poor, etc. The women I interviewed, the Iranian Jewish women who were watching this on TV, they didn't have the same response. They wished they were there. They loved it. They were so proud of the country. So you really do get this different narrative coming from the religious minorities than you do from most of the majority. They loved the Queen Farah. They looked at her as their Jacqueline Onassis. They wanted to imitate her. You did, as Alma talked about briefly, the Tudeh party, and you had Operation Ajax, in which Mossadegh was kicked out and the Shah was reinstated. And I asked these women, what did you think of that? And they were happy. They didn't want to be socialist. They didn't want to be communist. They liked the Shah. They liked his secularization policies. And out of coming from the Mahallahs and now becoming nouveau riche, middle class or upper middle class, and of course, not all of them were. They wanted to be a part of this culture of dressing beautifully, going to discos, going to the Alps, etc. So they were happy that the Shah got reinstated. And then, of course, the Pahlavi regime did not care about Jews as a religion as long as they were nationalistic towards the regime. And they eradicated the idea of Jews being impure. And that was incredibly important for the Jewish community. And then in 1950, they recognized Israel's right to exist. They opened up an embassy in Jerusalem. As Alma discussed, Iran still has the largest Jewish community in the Middle East outside of Israel. We don't know the exact numbers because there's not a census, but anywhere from 10 to 12,000. They sold oil to Israel, going from the Straits of Tiran into Haifa. El Al was flying in and out of Tehran. So for a lot of Iranian Jews, with Israel's independence, they did not feel like they had to leave because they weren't kicked out, really not until Khomeini comes into power. So a lot of them thought we were living the best of both worlds. We were living in Iran. Iran was supporting Israel. Israel was supporting Iran. We could go back and forth if we wanted to. There are Jews who made Aliyah, who did move. A lot of my family members did. And that was either because of their Zionism or Jews who were not becoming the middle class, who were still kind of living in poverty, moved to Israel too. I have 4 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly just go into the Islamic Revolution of Iran, 1979. This is when Jews knew they had to leave. Khomeini made the distinction that he is not anti-Jewish, he's anti-Zionist. You could be Jewish in the country, but you cannot support the state of Israel. The problem was there was no rule or law. So if you were a Jewish merchant and someone wanted to take your business, if you were a threat to them or they were competing with you, all they had to do was say, this person's a Zionist, that's it, you're in Ivan prison, no one ever hears from you again. So this is when people knew they had to leave. And then, of course, you had the Iran-Iraq war, where for 8 years, Iran and Iraq went to war with each other. Khomeini was taking 12-year-old boys and putting them into the first wave of the war. And that's, at first, it was just Muslim men, young boys that he was taking, but then everyone was supposed to join. And that's when Iranian Jews really knew that they had to get out. It was very difficult for them to get out at that point. So Harif stepped in and helped Iranian Jews get out via Austria, via Milan, etc. My uncle had to literally escape via Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Europe, America to get out during this time. There's so much to talk about, but I'm just going to go ahead. So the Iran that my family grew up in was this Iran, where women went to the university wearing mini skirts, Europeanized, where European hair care products, cologne was advertised everywhere. And the Iran they escaped was this Iran because they knew that this was not be a hospitable place for the Jewish community. This is Iran today. Unfortunately, we don't really have time to get into it so much. What was life like for Iranian Jews when they came to America, especially to Los Angeles and New York? Well, immediately they were dealing with a hostage situation, and there was so much hatred towards Iran, and people didn't make the distinction between the immigrants who were escaping this country and the people who held the Americans hostage. So things were very difficult at that time, and that's where Iranian Jews really played up their Jewish identity in America to separate themselves from the Islamic Republic. As you see, deport all Iranians. This is just right outside of where I live, just 10 minutes away. 1977, you had 100,000 Jews in Iran. 1980, around 30,000. In 2020, 2021, 22, 20,000 is a large number. Again, we don't know. I love this picture because it really conveys, even though it was taken in the 1980s, Jewish life in Iran. Here you have girls having a joint bat mitzvah. But remember, you can't be Zionist. So you could be in your synagogue, but you have to have a flag of Iran, you can't have a flag of Israel. And then, of course, all Iranian monarchs, Iranian Shia clerics, etc. You could be Jewish as long as it's under the table. You're not, out Jewish in public. And of course, you're not showing any Zionism. The Jewish community goes out of their way in Iran to really be anti-Zionist, and thus will make comments about Israel during an Israel-Gaza, Israel-Hamas war or something to make sure that they will never be accused of being Zionist and being tortured and imprisoned. So quickly, what was life like when they came to America? I talk a lot in my book about this. The suitcase mentality, Iranian Jews, it's been 40 plus years that we've been here. It took at least 20 to 30 years for them to recognize that their Paris of the Middle East is not going to come back to becoming the Paris of the Middle East, and that it will remain under Shia Islamic rule. And it's time to open up their suitcases, get involved with American life, become a part of the PTA, their schools, etc., that they will die in America, that their children and grandchildren will be born and raised in America. Like any immigrant community, homesickness, gender issues, family dynamics, conservative, traditional community versus an independent, secular, sexualized American community. How did Ashkenazi Jews treat us? They didn't even know we existed. It took me, only now do people have an appreciation for Mizrahi and Iranian history. I could not find a single class at Berkeley, Harvard, or UC Santa Barbara that taught about Mizrahi Jews, let alone Iranian Jews. So it's only now, and I'm grateful that the Mizrahi community, the Iranian community, is being discussed and looked at. Very hardcore Zionists. Zionism is very important to them. And I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Saba. Thank you, Alma. I hope our audience enjoy your exposition as much as I enjoy, because we see in a very brief time the complexities and diversities of the Jewish life in the Middle East. With Alma, we saw the minority within a minority, how to be a communist, a Jewish communist and Morocco nationalist. And with you, Saba, we saw the difficulties in the other way, how to be pro-Zionist and Jew and from Iranian. So we have a couple of questions. The first one is from Alma, is from Patricio. How's the name of your daughter, Alma, before the question?
Her name is Lynn.
Lynn? Lynn, perfect. Lynn se portó increíble. Alma, before 1948, I want to know how was the interaction between the Moroccan Jews and the non-Jewish Moroccan population. There was an anti-Semitic environment or not?
So I'll do the typical historian's answer. It's complicated. The one thing we need to unpack is the term anti-Semitism and what we mean specifically by it. Without going too far in depth about this, Jews under Muslim rule were subject to something called dhimmi status, which literally translates to protected status in Arabic, but meant different things in different times in a lot of different regions and reigns across the region. So it's virtually impossible to generalize what those experiences were like. And that status restricted things like the height of synagogues, or there were sartorial clothing restrictions, whether one could ride on a horse or not. But again, those things differed from time and place. Anti-Semitism doesn't exist as a term in the world until the 19th century, and it's coined in Germany by an avowed anti-Semite who sees Jews in racialized terms. So there was certainly discrimination against Jews as a religious grouping, as a religious minority, prior to the 19th century, prior to the coining of the term anti-Semitism in the 19th century. So we should understand anti-Semitism as a kind of racialized persecution of Jews, which is distinct from a religious grounds of persecution, if that makes sense. Most existed in Morocco prior to 1948 came from French colonial settlers or Spanish colonial settlers. I'm very interested in this, particularly during the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War. At this time where there was sort of the growth of fascist propaganda and right-wing politics, both among the French and among the Spanish. And they overtly tried to pander to Muslims on this assumption that Muslims were anti-Semitic. We don't really see any evidence that Muslims took them up on that. Rather, we see evidence that Muslims saw through it and saw the sort of racially charged intent behind that propaganda. So that's a long, if you want to email me, I'd be happy to address this in greater depth, but that is sort of the foundational way of answering that question.
Thank you, Alma. A question for Saba. We can talk about the Jewish Persian diaspora. What are the places where the Jewish from Iran arrived? You talk about Los Angeles, but maybe you can tell to us another places where we can find this Jewish diaspora from Iran.
Thank you. The Jewish diaspora in Iran, the largest community is in Los Angeles. And then you also have a smaller, but also very prolific community in Great Neck, New York. And the community in Great Neck is fascinating because you have Jews from other regions of Iran, but you specifically have a Jewish community from a very important city called Mashhad. Mashhadi Jews, Mashhad's important in the Shia religious tradition because the 9th Imam Reza has his tomb in Mashhad. And what happened in the 19th century is that Mashhadi Jews became what's known as Anusim, crypto Jews. So they were forced to convert to Shia Islam, but they held on to their Jewish beliefs. I curated a museum exhibition at UCLA called Light and Shadows, the Story of Iranian Jews. And that came to us from Beit HaTfutzot, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. And we had a lot of documents from the Mashhadi community. And it was really fascinating how they were able to maintain their Judaism while being Shia Islamic, devout religious people in public. For example, their tefillin, well, their Muslim-like headgear would have little tefillin inside of it. So, and then their Quran, we had Qurans that had the Hebrew scriptures inside of it. So it seemed like what they were doing was praying, but really they were davening with their tefillin on. Talk about getting married very, very young. Their children got married at 6 or 7 years old. Not that they were being placed together and living together at that age, but they were getting married that young to ensure that they married co-religionists, and they had a ketubah that was hidden, but then they also had a Muslim marriage contract. And so it was fascinating to see this community then in the 19th century. A lot of them went on the Hajj and then went to the second, after Mecca, Medina, then they went to Jerusalem and they stayed in Jerusalem and never went back to Iran. And this community has maintained its insularity and has a lot of deep pride in their Mashhadi history and culture, and they are a larger community in Great Neck, New York. But really, it's just Los Angeles and New York. I mean, you do see others around, but it's pretty rare. Persian Jews like to live with each other. We all have 48 first cousins, and we all live 10 to 15 minutes away.
Thank you, Saba. Tenemos que dejar dormir a Lynn, que se ha portado súper bien, la verdad. Se ha portado excelente, Lynn. Y dejar descansar a la mamá de Lynn y a Saba. Muchas gracias, Alma. Thank you very much, Alma. Gracias, Saba. Thank you very much. Para mí fue una exposición muy rica. Nos muestra la diversidad, la complejidad del mundo judío del Medio Oriente, desde el comunismo marroquí judío hasta lo difícil que es la vida judía en el Irán actual. Espero que todos hayan disfrutado la charla, muchachos. Thank you very much, Alma. Thank you very much, Saba. We hope to see you in the future to talk more about your topics. Congratulations for your books. Santiago is your home. Wherever you want to come to visit us, you are more than welcome with Lynn. Thank you very much, Alma. Thank you very much.
Gracias para todos.
Gracias, nos vemos pronto, que estén bien.